There's this idea in the parenting literature called the law of natural consequences. So the idea roughly is that if your child refuses to wear a coat, say, then instead of trying to force them to do so, you let them go out without the coat. And then the natural consequence of that is that they get cold. And the idea goes, they learn a lesson. Now, I'm not going to suggest that you apply this idea in the same way at work, exactly, but I do think there are some useful ideas contained in the concept of natural consequences. And in this video, I'm going to explain them and how you can make use of them as a leader. Hey, how's it going? This is Scruffy Leadership, a YouTube channel about management and leadership aimed particularly at software engineers. My name's Ben, and I've been a leader and a manager in the tech industry for over 25 years. I think there's a few main ways in which natural consequences can apply at work. So first, let's look at the direct parallel with the parenting idea. If you have a report that won't listen to your advice, you can take the view that you'll let them try it their way and learn from the natural consequences. Now, most of the time, this is not an appropriate tactic. It means you're treating your report like a child, which is not a good idea. Much better in general is to talk to your report like an adult and work with them. And another reason this isn't a good idea is that very often if something goes wrong at work, it's not just one person that suffers the consequences. So a rule of thumb here is that if you're going to use this idea as a learning exercise for a report, only do it if A, you've exhausted other possibilities, and B, if no one else is going to suffer as a result. On the other hand, natural consequences can be a useful way to frame certain types of discussion. It's a little bit like the SBI model that you may have come across for giving feedback. So in that model, you describe the situation, the behavior, and the impact that that behavior had. And that's a way to give feedback to somebody. With natural consequences, you simply explain the likely consequences to someone of following a particular path. So the point is that if you think of it this way, and if you express it this way, it can remove some of the emotion and make it less personal and subjective. So rather than saying, no, I really don't want you to do that, you can say much more calmly, okay, if you do that, here are the likely consequences. In some cases, you can go on to say, and I'm okay with those consequences, but I want to make sure that we both know what's coming. The point then is you don't necessarily use natural consequences to stop someone from doing something, but to help you and them to think more clearly about whether it's a good idea or not. And this doesn't just have to apply to your reports, it can apply to all kinds of stakeholders. And by the way, if you're not sure what a stakeholder is, I have a whole video on that subject, and I'll link it at the end of this video and in the description below. So as an example of applying this idea with stakeholders, if you're running a software project whose goal is to launch a new product and someone asks you to add a substantial new feature, instead of just fighting angrily against it, you can explain the consequences. So you might say, okay, sure, yeah, we can consider adding that feature, but if we aim to do it before launch, then we'll either have to move the launch date or remove some other features as we don't have time to hire new engineers. So the nice thing about this is that you don't have to just say no and have the response be yes. Instead, you can say yes, but. And although some people say that but is too negative a word and we shouldn't use it, it can actually be really important and helpful in these kinds of situations. You can use it to point out to someone who may be senior to you that there are consequences to what they're asking. Another aspect of this that I want to point out is the way it comes across to the person you're talking to. If you say to someone something along the lines of, I don't want you to do that, you're basically closing a metaphorical door. There's no conversation for us to have here because I don't want to have one. If on the other hand you say, well, you could do that, but the consequence of it will likely be this, then you're starting a conversation. Maybe they hadn't thought about the consequences, or maybe they already had and wanted to proceed anyway. Either way, you can have a better conversation if you start in this more open and level way. It's not quite true that you should always stick to the facts, because that would involve not being a human being. But on the other hand, if in certain cases you can see that there's likely to be a tricky conversation, or if someone isn't really hearing you, then moving from nebulous worries to specific objective facts can be very helpful. And the final way in which natural consequences apply is to yourself. The actions you take have consequences. If you shout at your report, you will damage your relationship with them. And if you do it more than once, it will likely lead to a worsening in morale and psychological safety, that will in turn have the consequence of making your team less effective overall. And I find it can be helpful to remember this. Your actions have consequences. And as a leader, those consequences tend to be magnified compared with an individual contributor's. And why is that? Well, partly it's because you have more actual power. You can change more things, affect more things. But more than that, it's the psychological effect of the fact that you have more influence. If you express a view that might have been quite inconsequential if you were an individual contributor, it might have a much bigger impact if you're a manager. So, for example, if you're in a meeting and someone expresses a new idea and you screw up your face and go, you might not mean it to have an effect, but as a leader, and perhaps even as the manager of the person whose idea it will likely have far more of an effect a consequence than you intend. Now, there's probably nothing in this video that isn't actually fairly obvious, but the point I want to make is not that you should necessarily be doing something radically different, but just that if you think about things in terms of natural consequences, it can often be beneficial, particularly if you find that your reaction to something is quite emotional. So it can stop you, for example, from taking into account who the person is that's asking you for something. So perhaps your reaction to the request is negative more because they've annoyed you recently or you just don't like them. And if you think rationally about the consequences of what they've asked for, you can either see that it's not a bad idea or you can find a more helpful way to respond. If someone's asking you for something at work, the likelihood is that they're a stakeholder of yours or of your projects. If you want to know more about what stakeholders are and how to work with them, check out the video that's on the screen now. And if you have thoughts or questions about this natural consequences idea, why not let me know in the comments below? Do you think it makes sense? And if you have ideas for subjects you'd like to see me cover in future videos, do let me know. I want the videos to be as useful for you as possible. Bye. See you soon.